2 siblings, a disease with no cure, and a death they awaited the way one awaits a meeting. Francisco was 10 years old when he died, Jacinta 11. Neither of them lived to see the First World War truly end. Francisco died in April 1919, Jacinta in February 1920. But both died knowing they were going to die. Our Lady had said so, according to the testimony the children themselves would later give, a testimony the Church would come to recognize, and they believed it with a tranquility that unsettled the adults around them. There was nothing in Aljustrel, the village near Fatima where the Marto family lived, no prior experience with children who died that way, resigned, even joyful at certain moments, speaking of death the way one speaks of a journey. The doctor who treated Jacinta in Lisbon, Dr. Lisboa, who later wrote about what he witnessed, declared he had never encountered a child like her. Not because of the illness, because of the peace. To understand the end, one must understand what came before. In 1917, 3 children were shepherding sheep on a hillside called Cova da Iria. Lucia dos Santos was 10 years old, Francisco Marto 9, Jacinta Marto 7. They were cousins. Lucia was the daughter of Maria Rosa and Antonio dos Santos. Francisco and Jacinta were the children of Manuel Pedro Marto and Olimpia, Maria Rosa's sister. They were ordinary children from a poor village in the interior of Portugal. They knew how to pray the rosary, poorly, according to Lucia herself, because they prayed in haste to get back to playing. They had no special instruction, no cultivated mysticism. Francisco was described as calm, meditative, passionate about birds and nature. Jacinta was the most outgoing of the 3, more emotional, prone to tears. Lucia was the oldest, the most articulate, the one who naturally took the lead. What happened between May and October of 1917 is a matter recognized by the Church. 6 apparitions of a woman who would identify herself, in the last of them, as Our Lady of the Rosary. A series of messages. And in October, in the presence of some 70,000 people, the phenomenon that came to be known as the Miracle of the Sun, recorded in secular newspapers of the time, including by reporters who had gone there to disprove everything and came back not knowing what they had seen. But here the story does not begin with the miracle. It begins with the message the children never fully made public during their lifetimes, or at least part of it. In July of 1917, during the 3rd apparition, Our Lady is said to have shown the 3 children a vision. Lucia would describe it decades later as a sea of fire, souls in torment, figures that burned without being consumed. And she would recount that Our Lady then spoke words that Francisco and Jacinta would carry for the rest of their brief lives, words that Lucia summarized as follows. Jacinta and Francisco, I will come to take them soon. Lucia will remain here longer. 7 years for Jacinta, 9 for Francisco. That was all they had left to live. It is not known exactly when this part was communicated to the families. What is known is that the children knew. And what is known, through Lucia's testimony written in her memoirs, a text approved by ecclesiastical authority and published, is that Francisco and Jacinta received this news with an acceptance that was not indifference. It was something else. It was a kind of deep consent. Francisco, according to Lucia, upon learning he would die young, asked only whether he too would go to heaven, and upon being told yes, on the condition that he pray many rosaries, as Our Lady was said to have asked, he was quiet for a moment and replied something to the effect of, "Then that is fine." The Spanish flu reached Portugal in 1918. They called it a pneumonica, the pneumonic. In Portugal, the epidemic killed between 55,000 and 60,000 people in a country of fewer than 6 million. It was a swift and brutal death, extremely high fever, lungs filling with fluid, young and healthy people who woke up sick and did not survive the week. In villages like Aljustrel, where medical resources were almost non-existent, the flu moved through families like fire through dry straw. Francisco Marto fell ill in the autumn of 1918. He was 10 years old. What began as flu-like symptoms progressed into severe pulmonary infection, bronchopneumonia, according to the medical accounts of the time. The boy was confined to bed. The fever was persistent. The complications kept compounding. What family members and neighbors noticed, and what they recorded in testimonies gathered later during the beatification process, was that Francisco did not show the anxiety typical of sick children. He did not complain. He did not cry. When the pain was more intense, he would fall quiet and close his eyes, and whoever was with him had the impression he was praying, because he was. Francisco had developed in the months following the apparitions a particular habit. He sought to be alone. He would go hide among the rocks on the hillside or sit quietly in a corner of the house with the rosary in his hands. When Lucia asked what he was doing, he would say he was thinking about God, that he was thinking about what he had seen, that he wanted to console Jesus, because Our Lady was said to have told the children that the heart of Jesus was wounded by the sins of men, and that image had caught Francisco in a special way. He thought about the heart of God suffering, and he wanted to do something about it, even being a 10-year-old boy in a nameless village. Prayer was what he could offer, and he offered it. From his sickbed, Francisco asked to receive First Communion. He had not yet received it. Children of that era made their First Communion later, and Francisco had not yet reached the age and formal preparation that local custom required. But illness accelerated everything. The priest was called. The boy was catechized in haste but with care. And in April of 1919, days before his death, Francisco Marto received the Eucharist for the first time. Those who were present, family members, the priest himself, described a boy in a state of recollection that seemed neither theatrical nor forced, quiet, radiant, some said, as though that for which he had been waiting had finally arrived. He died on April 4th, 1919. It was Holy Thursday. He was 10 years and 8 months old. His final days were recounted by Lucia in the memoirs, with the sobriety that marks all her writing. No ornaments, no dramatization, with the precision of someone recording something she has no desire to distort. Francisco told her in one of the last visits that he was sorry to leave her, but that he was happy, that he was going to see Our Lord and Our Lady. "Are you not afraid to die?" Lucia would have asked. Francisco's response as she recorded it: he had no fear at all. Jacinta survived her brother by 10 months, but her trajectory was different, and in certain respects, longer and harder. Jacinta also fell ill from the flu in the autumn of 1918. But unlike Francisco, whose lungs were the center of the disease, Jacinta developed pleurisy, inflammation of the pleura, the membrane surrounding the lungs. The pleurisy produced an abscess. The abscess required surgical intervention, and the sequence of medical treatments of the era, painful, invasive, without effective anesthesia, would extend over the following months, accompanying the girl to the last days of her life. Jacinta was taken to Urem for initial hospital treatment. There was no significant improvement. The bishop of the diocese, Dom José Alves Correa da Silva, the same one who years later would approve the apparitions, upon learning of the girl's condition, arranged for her to be transferred to Lisbon to a hospital with better resources. This happened in January of 1920. Jacinta was 11 years old. She had never left her village before the apparitions. Now she was boarding a train, ill, bound for a city she did not know, to be treated by doctors who would examine her with the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that doctors tend to bring to children who claim to have seen the Virgin Mary. If you'd like to support this work, consider becoming a channel member. You get exclusive emojis, a personalized name with an image of Mary, and early access to videos, and it's cheaper than a coffee. Click Join and be part of it. She was housed initially at the orphanage of Our Lady of Miracles in Lisbon, administered by a woman named Madre Godinho, who later wrote her memoirs of that period. She was then transferred to the hospital Dona Estefania, what the sources record about Jacinta in Lisbon is disturbing in a different way than expected. Not because she suffered greatly, but because she kept talking. Madre Godinho left recorded conversations with Jacinta during the weeks the girl spent in her care. These are conversations that must be read with the awareness that they represent personal testimony, not doctrinal document, but they are specific testimonies, concrete, with details that do not seem invented. Jacinta spoke about purgatory, about the need to pray for priests who would be held to the highest account for their failures. She spoke about war, about the need for penance, about the Immaculate Heart of Mary. She spoke about death with a familiarity that unsettled the adults around her. Dr. Manuel Ferreira de Castro Lisboa, the physician who treated her at Hospital Dona Estefania, left a deposition in the beatification process that deserves to be known. He was a man of science. He was not a particularly fervent believer. When he was assigned to treat Jacinta Marto, he knew who she was. All of Lisbon knew in some way who the little shepherds of Fatima were. But he approached her as a doctor approaches any child patient, with clinical attention and emotional distance. What he found disarmed him. Jacinta required surgery for the removal of 2 ribs, necessary because of the pleural abscess that had not responded to other treatments. The surgery was performed without adequate general anesthesia, which in practice meant that the girl felt the greater part of the procedure. Dr. Lisboa recorded that Jacinta did not scream. She did not ask them to stop. She lay quiet, with her eyes closed, and when he asked afterward what she had done throughout all that pain, she said she had offered it up for sinners. He did not quite know what to do with that. He wrote that in 40 years of medicine he had never encountered a child like her. Jacinta died on February 20th, 1920. At night, she was alone in her room. Accounts indicate that the nurses had passed through the corridor shortly before and found her apparently sleeping. When they returned, she had died. She was 11 years and 2 months old. Her death was in some way as she had described it would be, alone, serene. Without a human witness in that final moment, her body was laid out in Lisbon, then transferred to Urem, then to Fatima. The transfer of Jacinta's remains to the sanctuary of Fatima took place in 1935, Francisco's in 1952. Both would be beatified by John Paul II in May of 2000 at the Cova da Iria, before a crowd estimated at more than 1 million people, and canonized by Pope Francis in May of 2017 on the centenary of the apparitions. But canonization is the recognition of something that already existed. The holiness, if it existed, was not born in 2017. It was there before, in a 10-year-old boy who prayed alone among the rocks, thinking about the wounded heart of God, and in an 11-year-old girl who did not scream during surgery because she was occupied with offering up the pain. It is necessary to pause here for a moment, because it is easy when telling this story to slide into a kind of narrative that sounds edifying but loses the actual flesh of what happened. The narrative of holy children who died smiling, as though faith were an anesthetic that eliminated everything human and frightening. It was not like that. Francisco spent months in bed with a high fever. Jacinta underwent surgery that cut her open without her being able to scream from the pain. Both died deprived of a future they would never have, no adolescence, no growing up, no life that most children simply live without noticing that it is a gift. Their peace was not the absence of suffering. It was the presence of something else within the suffering. That is different, and that difference is the heart of everything. The Christian tradition, and specifically the Catholic tradition, has a word for what Francisco and Jacinta appear to have lived. The word is conformity. Not passive resignation, not pretending that pain does not hurt, but an alignment of one's own will with the will of Christ, who also suffered and who redeemed suffering from within. St. Paul wrote from prison. John of the Cross wrote from a cell. Teresa of Avila spent decades with illnesses that left her unable to move. The tradition of the saints is not a collection of lives protected from suffering. It is a collection of lives that traversed suffering in a way that changed the suffering from the inside. Francisco and Jacinta were children. They did not have the theological formation of Paul, nor the mystical experience of John of the Cross. They were 7 and 9 years old when they saw what they claimed to have seen. They were 11 and 10 when they died. But there is something in children that, in certain circumstances, accomplishes what formation cannot replace: a permeability, an incapacity for cynicism, an absence of those layers of protection that adults gradually build around the soul to avoid being hurt by what is real. Francisco and Jacinta were, in some way, unprotected in that sense, permeable. What they saw passed through them completely, and there was no undoing it. Lucia lived. She lived a long life. She died in February of 2005 at the age of 97 as Senior Maria Lucia of Jesus and of the Immaculate Heart, a discalced Carmelite in Coimbra. She lived long enough to see her cousin's beatification, to see the centenary of the apparitions approaching on the horizon, to deliver to the Church, in letters and in the 4 notebooks of her memoirs, everything she knew and was able to put into words. She wrote about Francisco and Jacinta with a tenderness that time had not diluted. She described the games of childhood before the apparitions, the game of pebbles, the songs they sang while tending the sheep, the small quarrels that children have. And then she described the change, how the apparitions had transformed them without destroying them, how Francisco had become quieter, more interior, how Jacinta had become more intense, more prone to tears and to penance, but both remained themselves. Francisco still had a fascination with birds. Jacinta still laughed at things she found funny. The spiritual transformation did not erase them, it deepened them, and when they fell ill, Lucia went to visit them. She sat at the edge of their beds. She prayed with them. She said her goodbyes. She did not write this dramatically. She wrote it the way one describes something that happened and that still hurts, quietly, decades later. There is a scene Lucia describes in the memoirs that has stayed. Francisco was ill, already near the end. Lucia went to visit him. He was lying down, pale, visibly weaker than the last time. But he was praying the rosary. He had the beads in his hands. Lucia asked whether he was suffering much. He said yes, but that he was offering it all to Jesus and to Our Lady. And then he asked whether she had made many sacrifices that day. He did not ask how she was doing. He did not speak about himself beyond what was necessary. He asked about her, as though, even sick and dying, the concern for the other had not diminished. Lucia wrote that she left there wanting to imitate her cousin. Jacinta, according to Madre Godinho's testimony, spoke frequently about purgatory and about sinners, not in an anxious or terrified way, in a way that suggested she had thought deeply about this and arrived at some interior resolution about what she wanted to do about it. What she wanted to do was suffer for them, offer, intercede. This may sound strange, an 11-year-old girl deciding to suffer willingly for people she did not even know. But it must be understood within the spiritual vocabulary that the apparitions themselves had planted in her. Our Lady, according to Lucia's account, had shown the children the consequences of sin, had asked for prayer and penance, had said that many souls were lost because there was no one to pray and make sacrifices for them. Jacinta heard this at 7 years old. It entered her, and it never left. This was not masochism. It was not a desire for self-punishment. It was something that, within Catholic teaching, carries a clear meaning, participation in the redemptive mystery of Christ, the doctrine that the suffering of the faithful, when united to the suffering of Christ, can become part of God's saving work in the world. This is what Paul writes to the Colossians when he speaks of completing in his own flesh what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ, not because Christ's suffering is insufficient, but because Christ chose to include the members of his body in that work. John Paul II developed this teaching at length in Salvifici Doloris, his 1984 apostolic letter on the Christian meaning of suffering. Jacinta had understood this, in an intuitive way, not a conceptual one, in a way that did not require theology to express itself, because it expressed itself directly in choice. Jacinta's pleural abscess was constantly painful, the pleurisy inflamed. The surgery left consequences. The final months were of a pain that, in the accounts of those present, was clearly real and clearly intense. And yet, when the doctors or nurses asked whether she was suffering, Jacinta said yes, and completed the answer by saying she was offering it up. She did not deny the pain. She did not pretend it did not hurt. She confirmed it and immediately placed it in another register, as one who transforms the material of suffering into something different without falsifying it. This requires an interior maturity that is not produced by formation. Formation can accompany it, deepen it, but it does not give birth to it. It is born of an encounter, and Jacinta had had hers. There is a question that historians and theologians raise when studying the little shepherds, and which is honest to put forward. To what extent were the children prepared or pressured into assuming the role they assumed? It is a legitimate question. The adults around the shepherds were not all benefactors. There was, especially in the summer of 1917, immense pressure on 3 small children, civil authorities who attempted to intimidate them, including with threats of death, to make them retract what they claimed to have seen. Jacinta, at 7 years old, was detained along with her cousins by the administrator of the municipality, Artur de Oliveira Santos, and separated from Lucia and Francisco in an attempt to make her, alone, yield and deny everything. She did not yield. Francisco did not either. This proves nothing about the content of the visions. A child's bravery in the face of threats is not theological evidence, but it says something about their character, and it suggests that the steadiness they showed while ill years later was not built on fear of contradicting adults. It was, on the contrary, a steadiness that had already resisted fear. The Church took decades to pronounce itself on Fatima. Dom José Alves Correa da Silva, Bishop of Leiria, issued the decree of approval only in 1930, 13 years later. This slowness is not a sign of indifference. It is a sign of seriousness. The Church investigated. It gathered testimonies. It examined the accounts. It confronted the documents against the facts. And in the end, the bishop declared the shepherd's visions worthy of belief. Worthy of belief, the technical expression used for approved Marian apparitions, is not a declaration of obligatory faith. The Church does not require any Catholic to believe in Fatima in order to be a good Catholic. Private apparitions, even approved ones, do not form part of the deposit of faith. But worthy of belief means that the Church, after investigation, found no reason to reject them and found reasons to recognize them. What it found, among other things, was the coherence between the children's lives and deaths and what they claimed to have received. There was no interest in inventing. There was nothing to gain. The Marto family was a poor family of peasants who, after the apparitions, spent years under constant public exposure, pilgrims knocking at the door, journalists asking questions, authorities trying to destabilize everything. Manuel Marto, father of Francisco and Jacinta, said later that he would have preferred none of it to have happened if he had the choice, but that it had happened, and he believed. Pope Francis, in the homily of the canonization Mass in May of 2017 at the Cova da Iria, said something that remained. that Francisco and Jacinta were sanctified by the grace that flowed from the apparitions, but also, and above all, by the personal adherence of each of them to what they had received. That holiness is not automatic, that the same message that reached all three shepherds reached each one differently, and each responded with everything they were, with their own personality, with their limits, and with their freedom. Francisco responded with contemplation and silence. Jacinta responded with love and oblation. Lucia responded with fidelity and perseverance. 3 temperaments, 3 responses, 1 grace at the source. Here is a moment to speak to those who follow this channel. If you have come this far in the account, you probably did not arrive by accident. Something in this story spoke to you. If this kind of content makes sense to you, stories told slowly, with care, without haste, it is worth subscribing and following what comes next. The invitation is simple and without exaggeration. This is a space for those who want to think about faith seriously. Returning to Francisco, there is a detail in his life that Lucia mentions and that says much about who he was. Francisco had difficulty with words. He was not exactly shy, but he preferred silence to speech. When asked about the apparitions, which happened frequently because the curiosity around them was enormous, he said little, not because he did not want to, but because he felt that what he had seen did not fit well into words. He said that what had marked him most deeply in the apparitions was not Our Lady, though he loved her dearly. Our Lady of the Rosary he loved very much, but what had pierced him inside was the vision of our Lord. Exactly what he had seen, the documents do not clarify with precision. Lucia is vague about this, perhaps because Francisco was also vague in describing it. But the effect was clear. Francisco had seen something of the suffering of God and could not forget it, and he could not accept that most of the people around him did not know or did not care. This weight did not make him heavy. It made him quiet. It made him interior. It made him that boy who would go sit among the rocks alone with his rosary and stay there until he was called in for supper. And when illness found him, he continued doing what he knew how to do. He prayed. There is a tendency, when speaking of holy children, to romanticize childhood as though childhood holiness were easier than adult holiness. As though children simply did not know how to be afraid, or as though their innocence protected them from the weight of what is real. But Jacinta knew she was dying. She knew she would not return to Aljustrel. When she left for Lisbon in January of 1920, she said goodbye to her mother with an awareness that her mother Olympia only fully understood afterward, because Jacinta had said, with a calm that Olympia mistook for hope, that she would not see her again in this life. An 11-year-old girl saying a real goodbye to her mother with serenity. That is not innocence. That is something else entirely. It is a possession of herself, a clarity about what was happening that most adults cannot maintain in a fraction of the circumstances Jacinta faced. In Lisbon, during the weeks at the orphanage before she was transferred to the hospital, Jacinta was in close contact with Madre Godinho. The conversations that Madre Godinho recorded in her memoirs are the most direct documents we have of Jacinta's interior state in her final months. Madre Godinho wrote that Jacinta seemed at certain moments to know things she should not have known. Not about future events, or not necessarily, but about people, about the interior state of those who entered her room. This episode that Madre Godinho recounts was not the subject of formal canonical verification as a miracle or supernatural charism by the Church. It is personal testimony offered faithfully. On one occasion, a woman came to visit Jacinta and stayed only a short while, uncomfortable with the situation. The girl's illness, the atmosphere of the orphanage, the conversation that took turns she had not anticipated. When the woman left, Jacinta is said to have told Madre Godinho that the woman carried a hidden sadness, that she needed prayer. Madre Godinho later looked into it. The woman was going through a severe family crisis she had not mentioned to anyone. This is not a miracle in the strict sense. It may be heightened sensitivity. It may be the intuition of a child who has not yet built the filters that adults develop. It may be something else. Madre Godinho recorded it as she recorded it. There is no way to verify or disprove it with the instruments we have. What can be said is that these accounts are consistent with the character Jacinta demonstrated throughout her brief life. An attention to the other, a concern that was not abstract but personal, directed at specific people. What Francisco and Jacinta left behind is not a doctrine. They wrote nothing, Francisco because he was very young and likely barely literate, Jacinta because she too was too young and did not have time. What they left was the example of a life, and a short life at that. But there is something in brevity that concentrates. A life of 90 years may have moments of intensity scattered across decades of the ordinary. A life of 10 or 11 years, which was traversed by a transformative experience and cut short by a painful illness, has a different concentration. The essential becomes more visible because there is less time for the non-essential to cover it. In the case of Francisco and Jacinta, the essential was simple. It can be said in a few sentences: that God exists and that the heart of God cares about men, that men frequently live as though God did not exist, and that this has consequences, that prayer and penance, a difficult word for modern ears, but which at its core simply means the disposition to accept the suffering that comes rather than merely rejecting it, are real ways of participating in God's work in the world, and that dying is not the end of anything that truly matters. Francisco and Jacinta lived these few principles with a coherence that unsettled those who knew them, not because they were superhuman, but because they had seen something that had rendered them capable of a coherence they might never have reached under other circumstances. The Cova da Iria is today one of the most visited Marian shrines in the world. Millions of people pass through every year, some on pilgrimage of faith, some out of curiosity, some in search of healing or of an answer to a question they have been carrying for years. Inside the sanctuary, in a modest little chapel, are the tombs of Francisco and Jacinta. They are simple tombs of white marble, with the names, with the dates: Francisco Marto, 1908-1919, Jacinta Marto, 1910-1920. The dates are short. They would fit in a margin of a page. But what is deposited in those tombs, what those lives touched, what those deaths say about what is possible within a human being when they are traversed by something greater, that fits in no margin at all. There is one last thing worth saying. Jacinta, in her final days in Lisbon, according to Madre Godinho's testimony, spoke about Our Lady with a longing that seemed concrete, not abstract, not the way one longs for a character or an idea, but concrete, the way one longs for someone they have met. She said she wanted to see Our Lady again, and that she would see her soon. Days later, she was dead. What this means, whether it is faithful testimony, whether it is retrospective interpretation, whether it is something else, remains with each person who hears it. The Church does not oblige anyone to conclude anything about it. It says only that the life of Jacinta Marto was a holy life, that her death was the death of a saint, and that holiness is not a prize for those who did not suffer. It is, on the contrary, the highest form of responding to the suffering that arrives, not denying that it hurts, not pretending it is easy, not sickening with bitterness, but passing through with open hands, offering what there is to offer, waiting for what there is to wait for. Francisco waited for Holy Thursday. Jacinta waited for the February night, and both of them went. Grant us, Lord, the peace that Francisco sought among the rocks and that Jacinta carried in her fractured bones. May our death, when it comes, find us as ready as they were, and may our life, while it lasts, carry at least a trace of that transparency through which grace passes.